April 1945. A narrow street on the outskirts of a shattered German town. The war has already moved east, but its remains still breathe here. Brick dust hangs in the air. Windows are empty sockets. Roofs lie folded inward like broken ribs. Near a collapsed schoolhouse, children stand quietly. Some barefoot, some clutching tin cups. They do not cheer. They do not run. They watch. American soldiers move down the street. Not advancing, not firing. One carries a clipboard. Another unloads crates from a truck marked with white stenciled letters. A third speaks slowly, pointing toward an intact building nearby. There is no shouting, no threat, only procedure. For these children, this is unfamiliar. For years, enemies arrived as bombers or artillery. Now they arrive with lists, schedules, and instructions. The uniforms are foreign. The language is strange. But the behavior is unexpected. Instead of orders to flee, there are directions to line up. Instead of interrogation, there are questions about names and ages. Instead of punishment, there is food measured, recorded, and distributed evenly. The war, as they understood it, has ended. But something else has begun. And in this moment, German children begin to realize that the enemy has not come only to occupy, but to administer. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War in Europe had entered its terminal phase. What remained of the German state was collapsing not only militarily, but administratively. Cities had been hollowed out by years of aerial bombardment. Rail lines lay twisted and unusable. Municipal offices had burned or been abandoned. Food distribution systems no longer functioned in any coordinated way. Authority existed in fragments, often exercised by whoever still possessed paper, stamps, or a surviving building. For children, this collapse was absolute. The institutions that had structured their lives, schools, youth organizations, welfare offices, had disappeared almost overnight. Many fathers were dead or missing, killed on distant fronts or captured during the rapid Allied advances of early 1945. Mothers were often displaced, hospitalized, or forced into constant movement in search of food. Evacuation programs that had once promised safety dissolved into chaos as transport networks failed. Across western and central Germany, children were left behind in cellars, damaged apartment blocks, hospitals without staff, and rural villages stripped of supplies. Some had been separated during evacuations months earlier. Others had watched parents disappear during air raids or street fighting. By the time American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, thousands of German children were living without supervision, documentation, or reliable access to food. The advancing U.S. Army had not been trained for this reality. Its doctrine focused on defeating enemy units, securing terrain, and maintaining rear area security. Military manuals addressed prisoners of war and hostile civilians. They did not account for unaccompanied children wandering battle zones or sleeping inside bomb buildings after combat had passed. Yet these encounters became routine. Infantry units entering towns discovered children hiding in basements long after fighting ended. Medical detachments treated malnourished minors brought in by civilians who no longer knew where to take them. Supply convoys were followed by groups of children hoping for discarded rations. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns forming behind the front lines. At the same time, the German civil administration that might have addressed this crisis no longer functioned. Local officials were dead, missing, or discredited by association with the Nazi regime. Records had been destroyed. Birth certificates, school registries, and welfare files no longer existed in many districts. Even when surviving administrators remained, they lacked authority, resources, or trust. For American commanders, this created an unexpected problem. Unattended children posed health risks, security risks, and long-term instability. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded ruins. Children moved unpredictably across unsecured areas. Their presence complicated occupation duties that were only beginning to take shape. These conditions forced American forces to confront a reality they had not anticipated. Victory had produced responsibility. And that responsibility would soon reshape how occupation itself was conducted. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany during March and April 1945, the distinction between combat operations and occupation blurred rapidly. Entire regions fell under U.S. control faster than any pre-war planning had anticipated. Towns surrendered without resistance. German units dissolved or fled eastward. What remained behind the advancing front was not order, but vacuum. In that vacuum, children became the most visible indicator of collapse. Military government detachments, small, lightly staffed units attached to field armies, began submitting reports that differed sharply from standard operational summaries. Instead of enemy strength or infrastructure damage, they described classrooms filled with sleeping children, hospitals crowded with minors whose parents could not be located, and rural communities overwhelmed by evacuees they could not support. By early April 1945, Allied intelligence assessments acknowledged that civilian displacement in Germany had reached unprecedented levels. Refugee flows moved without coordination. Food shortages intensified as planting seasons were disrupted and transport networks remained shattered. Children, unable to travel long distances or compete with adults for resources, were disproportionately affected. The scale of the problem extended beyond Germany. In Austria, American forces encountered similar conditions as they crossed into territories annexed by the Reich in 1938. In northern Italy, liberated areas revealed children displaced by years of fighting and occupation. Even as the war in Europe approached its end, planners began to anticipate comparable crises in Japan, where strategic bombing was already devastating urban centers. Despite this, no comprehensive policy for child welfare existed within Allied operational doctrine. Civil affairs units had mandates to restore basic order, policing, sanitation, and utilities, but long-term humanitarian care was not their primary function. Relief organizations such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, created in 1943, were designed to operate only after combat zones stabilized. In the spring of 1945, stability did not yet exist. This gap forced improvisation. American officers on the ground began issuing local directives, often without waiting for higher authorization. Vacant schools, monasteries, and undamaged municipal buildings were requisitioned. Children found without guardians were gathered, examined by medical personnel, and provided with food under supervision. These measures were practical rather than ideological. They aimed to prevent disease, reduce disorder, and keep children from disappearing into black markets or criminal networks forming in the ruins. Documentation followed. Names were recorded when possible. Estimated ages were noted. Health conditions were logged in field notebooks and weekly reports. These records, initially intended for internal accountability, would later form the basis of systematic child welfare administration. German civilians observed these actions with uncertainty. Years of propaganda had framed Allied forces as punitive occupiers. For children raised under those narratives, the sight of American soldiers organizing shelters rather than enforcing punishment was disorienting. Trust did not come easily. Many children resisted at first, fleeing or refusing food. But consistency mattered. Shelters that maintained routines, regular meals, assigned sleeping spaces, scheduled medical checks, saw fear gradually give way to cautious acceptance. By the time Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, these improvised measures had become patterns. What began as local responses to immediate problems was evolving into a broader system. The American military, unprepared for this role, was nonetheless becoming an administrator of civilian survival. And from this foundation, new questions emerged about purpose, authority, and the moral dimensions of victory that would define the next phase of the story. From the human angle, the presence of American administrators reshaped childhood in defeated Germany in ways few had anticipated. For German children in 1945, authority had always worn a uniform that demanded obedience and fear. Schools, youth organizations, and civil offices had functioned as extensions of the state, reinforcing hierarchy and discipline. When those structures collapsed, children were left without reference points. Hunger, displacement, and silence replaced instruction and routine. American soldiers entered this vacuum carrying authority of a different kind. They were armed, foreign, and victorious, but they were also tasked with registering names, distributing food, and reopening schools. To children who had grown up expecting punishment from enemies, the shift was unsettling. Orders were still given, but they were followed by explanations. Lines formed not for inspections but for meals. Rules existed, but they were enforced to preserve health rather than loyalty. For many children, this was the first experience of authority separated from ideology. The military angle framed these actions in more pragmatic terms. U.S. commanders did not interpret child administration as moral theater. They saw instability as a security risk. Unsupervised children congregated around supply depots, scavenged in dangerous ruins, and moved unpredictably between towns. Disease outbreaks among civilians threatened troops as well. Feeding and housing children reduced chaos behind the lines and freed combat units from constant civilian encounters. Civil affairs officers translated humanitarian needs into operational language. Their reports emphasized reduced disorder, improved sanitation, and lower demands on patrol units once shelters and administrative routines were established. Child welfare became a stabilizing mechanism, an extension of military control achieved through organization rather than force. From the moral angle, American administrators faced questions that doctrine did not answer. Victory had been achieved through overwhelming violence. Cities lay in ruins because of strategic choices made deliberately. Children were living inside the consequences of those choices. Military memoranda began to reflect this tension. They did not express guilt, but they did emphasize responsibility. Children were classified explicitly as non-combatants without culpability. Their treatment became a measure of how occupation authority would define itself. For German civilians watching these developments, the effect was gradual but profound. The enemy was no longer only a destroyer. It was now a manager of daily life. This contradiction did not erase trauma, but it altered expectations. And as these perspectives converged, human vulnerability, military necessity, and moral responsibility, the role of the American occupier continued to expand, drawing the story into deeper and more complex angles still unfolding. From the institutional angle, the transformation was subtle but decisive. What began as localized improvisation slowly hardened into policy. By late April and early May 1945, U.S. military government units issued standardized guidance for civilian administration, including explicit provisions for children. Registration forms were introduced. Health inspections became routine. Schools reopened under supervision not to teach ideology, but to restore structure. Authority was no longer exercised only through checkpoints and patrols, but through schedules, records, and continuity. For American administrators, this represented a shift in how power functioned. Occupation was no longer defined solely by control of territory. It became management of society. Children, once invisible in operational planning, emerged as indicators of success or failure. Where children were fed, sheltered, and accounted for, towns stabilized. Where they were not, disorder persisted. Reports increasingly reflected this logic, treating child administration as a core component of governance rather than an auxiliary task. The enemy perception angle revealed how disorienting this shift was for German children themselves. They had been taught to expect retribution. Authority, in their experience, demanded conformity and sacrifice. Instead, American administrators enforced rules that emphasized health, safety, and routine. Punishment existed, but it was limited and procedural. The absence of ideological instruction was itself striking. There were no slogans, no pledges, no rituals of loyalty. Many children responded with confusion rather than relief. Some resisted participation. Others tested boundaries, expecting violence that did not come. Over time, predictability changed behavior. Regular meals mattered more than speeches. Warm classrooms mattered more than flags. Trust did not emerge suddenly, but it grew through repetition. Authority became something that organized life instead of threatening it. The administrative evolution angle ties these developments together. By mid-1945, American occupation policy had absorbed lessons learned under pressure. Child welfare was integrated into broader Reconstruction planning. Records compiled during the first months of occupation informed family reunification efforts, public health initiatives, and education reform. Relief organizations arriving later inherited systems that were already functioning. In this way, German children encountered American authority not at the moment of conquest, but during its transformation into governance. The enemy they had been warned about arrived first as soldiers, but remained as administrators. And it was this transition, from battlefield victory to structured control of civilian life, that set the stage for the decisive turning point, when temporary measures became permanent policy and occupation redefined itself entirely. The turning point arrived quietly, without ceremony or announcement, in the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945. There was no single directive that marked the change. No declaration that occupation had entered a new phase. Instead, the shift became visible through paperwork, logistics, and routine, through decisions made repeatedly across hundreds of towns now under American control. With combat operations concluded, U.S. forces transitioned formally from advancing armies to occupying authorities. This altered the hierarchy of priorities. Security remained essential, but it no longer dominated every calculation. Stability, measurable, sustained, and administrative became the defining objective. And within that framework, the condition of children emerged as one of the clearest indicators of whether order was truly being restored. Military government units began conducting systematic surveys of civilian life. Teams moved through districts documenting housing damage, food availability, sanitation, and population movement. For the first time, unaccompanied children were counted as a category rather than as isolated encounters. Lists replaced anecdotes. Numbers replaced impressions. What had once been described as scattered cases was now understood as a structural consequence of total war. Commanders recognized that improvisation could no longer carry the burden. Shelters established during combat had depended on individual initiative and local goodwill. That approach was unsustainable. Facilities required staffing, medical oversight, and predictable supply chains. In response, authority was expanded. Civil affairs officers were granted standing permission to requisition buildings specifically for child care. Schools, monasteries, and intact municipal halls were converted into permanent facilities under American supervision. This marked a decisive shift. Child administration was no longer an emergency response. It became embedded within occupation governance. Medical officers were assigned rotating duties to shelters. Supply units adjusted requisition schedules to include civilian nutritional needs. Liaison teams were formed to coordinate with emerging German welfare offices, carefully vetted to exclude former Nazi officials. Documentation intensified. Registries recorded names when possible, estimated ages, health conditions, and known family connections. These records served multiple purposes. They enabled reunification efforts. They reduced duplication of aid. They also demonstrated accountability, evidence that authority was being exercised through administration rather than arbitrariness. For German children, the effects were immediate and tangible. Shelters acquired regular schedules. Meals arrived at predictable hours. Sleeping spaces were assigned and maintained. Medical examinations followed routines rather than urgency. Authority became something continuous rather than sudden, present every day, not only in moments of crisis. This normalization altered perception. The enemy was no longer defined solely by the violence that had preceded occupation. It was now associated with order, predictability, and continuity. Not trust, at least not yet, but a growing recognition that life was no longer collapsing. And as this system took shape across the American zones, its implications extended beyond Germany, hinting at a broader application that would soon unfold elsewhere. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, the transition reached beyond Europe, confirming that what had occurred in Germany was not an anomaly, but a model taking shape. In August, Japan's surrender ended active combat in the Pacific. American forces, now operating under the authority of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, entered a society devastated by years of war and months of sustained aerial bombardment. Entire districts of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama lay flattened. Civil administration was paralyzed. Food shortages were acute. And once again, children were among the most exposed. The experience gained in Germany informed early occupation decisions. American planners did not arrive with complete solutions, but they arrived with precedent. Temporary shelters were established in surviving public buildings. Feeding programs prioritized children. Medical screenings focused on malnutrition, respiratory illness, and infectious disease. As in Europe, these measures were framed not as charity, but as stabilization, necessary for restoring order in a society emerging from defeat. Back in Germany, the consequences of institutionalization became increasingly visible. By late summer, improvised shelters had been absorbed into standardized systems. Oversight mechanisms expanded. Inspection schedules were formalized. Supply allocations stabilized. Relief agencies, particularly UNRRA, began assuming operational roles in facilities originally created by American military governments. The transition was deliberate. Military authority receded gradually, ensuring continuity rather than disruption. This convergence marked the true climax of the story. The shelters had moved beyond their origins as battlefield adaptations. They were now pillars of occupation policy, replicated across regions and cultures. What unified them was not ideology, but method, identification, registration, routine, and care. The American military, designed for combat, had become an administrator of civilian recovery. For German children, this shift defined how the war truly ended. Not with surrender announcements or flag ceremonies, but with the return of daily structure. Classrooms reopened. Health checks became regular. Meals arrived consistently. Authority no longer appeared only in moments of fear, but in predictable forms that allowed life to resume. This moment reshaped the meaning of victory. Power was no longer measured solely by defeated armies or occupied territory. It was expressed through the ability to impose order without coercion, and to sustain it. The shelters embodied that transformation, turning the aftermath of destruction into the first stage of recovery. And as this new equilibrium settled across occupied societies, its long-term effects began to emerge, quietly altering behavior, expectations, and the psychological landscape of post-war life.